Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Think about an observer walking into a vast, kind of sparsely lit gallery, and across the room, drawing their eye immediately, is this framed piece of art illuminated by a single spotlight.
Right.
It's completely captivating. So they cross the room, entirely pulled by the gravity of this object. But when they finally step up to the frame, they realize something strange. The glass covering the canvas is angled in such a highly specific, deliberate way that the artwork itself is totally obscured.
Wow.
Yeah, and no matter how they tilt their head, the only thing they can actually see in the frame is their own reflection.
And, the really provocative implication of that scenario, if we actually follow the logic of the framework we're examining today, is that the observer did not cross the room to perceive the art. The art is irrelevant. They crossed the room because their internal apparatus required a highly polished surface to reflect itself back to them.
Exactly. And that dynamic is the exact center of our mission today on this deep dive. We are unpacking a fiercely argued, honestly incredibly dense essay titled The Mirror of Function, Structural Architecture of Desire.
Which is a heavy title.
Very heavy. It's written by theorist R.J. Starr, and it functions as a cornerstone of his broader psychological architecture framework, which is published through Depthmark Press.
Right.
And our goal today is to systematically dismantle Starr's really radical claim that every time a subject desires something, whether it is an object, a status, or even person, they aren't actually looking at that thing at all. They're recruiting it to serve as a mirror.
It is a profound, almost jarring reclassification of human behavior. I mean, it really is. But before we get into the gears and levers of how Starr claims this works, we need to establish the exact parameters of how we are going to analyze his framework.
Yeah, that's important.
Because this material can very easily be misinterpreted if we approach it with the wrong expectations.
That is a crucial warning. We are operating strictly within an analytical register today. This is a rigorous third-person examination of a theoretical psychological framework.
Right. No self-help today.
Exactly. We are not exploring emotional wellness. We are not doing a segment on personal advice. And we are absolutely not looking at this through a therapeutic lens to figure out how to fix relationships.
Yeah, that's not what Starr is doing.
We are going to examine the mechanics of desire exactly as R.J. Starr presents them in his essay. So, as a systemic apparatus of human attention and perception.
And my role here will be to maintain that analytical pressure, because Starr makes incredibly definitive, uncompromising claims about the limits of human perception.
He really does.
By categorizing desire as a purely mechanical mechanism, he establishes very firm logical boundaries. And as we navigate the sequence of his argument, I intend to interrogate those boundaries.
I expect nothing less.
Well, we need to examine whether his classifications hold up under scrutiny, whether his theoretical framework encounters friction with the messy reality of human behavior, and specifically what the implications are when you reduce human longing to a mechanical operation.
So let's start with Starr's foundational premise, which is that desire is invariant across domains.
Invariant.
Right.
According to the psychological architecture framework, it does not matter if the object in question is romantic, if it is material wealth, or if it's a certain social status.
The mechanism of desire remains identical.
Yes, identical. The object's role is strictly utilitarian. It gets slotted into a pre-existing internal schematic. As Starr explicitly writes, and this is, quote, "The surface of the object varies, but the mechanism of the desire does not."
And that invariance is what brings us directly into the concept of the mirror function itself. Starr insists that desire is not a response to the inherent qualities of an external object.
Right.
It's an internal projection demanding a surface.
Let's break down exactly how Starr argues this sequence. He states that when desire is active, the perceiving subject is not actually encountering the object on its own terms.
No, they're not.
They are perceiving what contact with that object or possession of it means for their own identity. So if a subject desires immense wealth, Starr argues they are not perceiving the reality of wealth. Right. They aren't seeing the logistics or the isolation or the actual physical money.
Exactly. They are perceiving what wealth would confirm about their own worth. or the insulation it would provide against their specific fears, or the internal claims of inadequacy it would supposedly settle.
And he applies the same ruthless logic to interpersonal dynamics, too.
Oh, yeah.
If a subject desires another person, Starr claims they are not encountering that individual's complex reality. They are perceiving what being desired by that specific person constitutes for their own identity structure.
The object is selected entirely because of the specific reflection it returns to the self.
Right, which introduces his concept of the aperture.
Right.
I mean, this is where the essay gets really intense.
It does. It fundamentally shifts how we talk about attention.
Yeah. Starr points out that attributes of the object that serve this required reflection are massively amplified in the subject's mind, but attributes that do not serve the reflection are not just minimized, they are systemically inaccessible.
And he makes a very aggressive point of separating the word ignored from inaccessible.
That distinction is the absolute hinge of his entire argument regarding human perception.
Because to say that information is ignored implies that the perceiving subject has a choice.
Exactly. It implies that the full three-dimensional reality of the object exists in the perceptual field, and the subject is merely passing over certain details through selective attention.
Like subconsciously choosing to look the other way when a flaw appears.
Right. But Starr says the mirror function is infinitely more constraining than selective attention.
He argues that properties of the object that do not serve the self's reflection simply cannot be rendered by the perceiving apparatus.
Think of it like a camera lens fitted with a highly specific filter.
A filter that only lets in a very specific shape of light.
Yes. The aperture of attention is shaped entirely by what the self requires to see in order to maintain its own identity structure. Anything outside that shape does not even register as existing.
So the subject cannot see a reduced or flawed version of the object. They are not seeing the object at all.
No, they're only seeing the projected image of their own needs.
Think about how wild that claim is. Starr isn't saying a person chooses to overlook a red flag in a situation they deeply desire. He's saying their perceptual machinery literally cannot render that information because it contradicts the reflection their identity requires at that moment.
And because of this dynamic, Starr introduces what he calls the solitude of desire.
The solitude of desire. I mean, it is a haunting phrase for a psychological theorist to use.
It is, but he means it quite literally in a mechanical sense.
He does. The logic follows that if the subject is only ever in contact with their own projection, then desire structurally forecloses any possibility of genuine encounter.
Right.
Even if the object of desire is physically present, even if there is immense physical intimacy or proximity, Starr argues that this closeness does not dissolve the mirror function.
Proximity, he writes, is merely a spatial fact.
Exactly. And the mirror function is an attentional fact.
I like to picture this like wearing a fully immersive virtual reality headset in a crowded room.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
You know, you might be physically inches away from another human being. You might even be bumping into them. But perceptually, you are entirely enclosed in a simulation generated by your own hardware.
You are alone with your own rendering.
Yes. But here is where we hit our first major point of theoretical friction in the essay.
I figured you were going to bring this up.
We have to. Starr is very explicit about how we should interpret this solitude. He states that calling desire a form of solitude is a structural reclassification and firmly not a moral indictment.
Right. He insists that the mirror function is mechanical, not moral.
It's not a failure of character or a lapse in empathy, according to him. It is just the inevitable operation of the human perceptual system.
So we have to stop and press on this because it raises a massive question about the explanatory limits of a purely systemic framework.
Does classifying desire as a mechanical inevitability actually do real theoretical work? Or is it a maneuver that conveniently sidesteps a massive ethical dilemma?
I see where you are going. If the theory says, well, this is just how the machine works, it removes responsibility from the operator.
Precisely. Consider what happens when the object of desire is another human being.
Okay, let's look at that.
If Starr's framework dictates that this person is merely an instrument recruited to serve the self's reflection,
And that their independent properties are systemically inaccessible to the person desiring them.
then we are describing a profound, totalizing instrumentalization of another person.
We're talking about pure objectification.
Exactly. By stripping away the moral dimension and labeling this entirely mechanical, does Starr's framework limit its own ability to address the consequences of that utility?
So if a subject is functionally incapable of encountering the person they desire, You're asking if the framework gives them a theoretical alibi for how they treat that person.
I'm questioning whether a strict adherence to a mechanical blueprint can adequately map human behavior without eventually having to account for the ethical weight of that behavior.
That's a fair question.
Because a clean theoretical model is intellectually satisfying, it makes for a brilliant essay. But the unresolved tension here is between this cold, mechanical architecture and the reality of lived ethics.
Right.
If an object, a person, is used merely as a reflective surface rather than encountered as an independent being, declaring that usage, not a moral indictment, feels like an evasion of the very dynamic the theory has successfully diagnosed.
That is a fascinating tension, and I think we have to leave it open because Starr is absolutely uncompromising on that point.
He really is. He refuses to introduce morality into the equation.
He insists it is a closed mechanical loop, and he extends that exact logic perfectly into his analysis of longing, which is the second major sequence of the essay.
Right, let's get into longing.
He describes longing not as an emotion, but as the temporal extension of desire across distance or absence.
If we connect this to the physics of his framework, longing is where the mirror function is actually tested by the reality of the external world.
Let's look at how Starr defines the concepts of friction and resistance, because this is key.
Yeah.
When an object is physically present, it possesses independent properties. It has textures, behaviors, schedules, and qualities that do not align perfectly with the subject's projective needs.
The object keeps interrupting the reflection.
Right, and Starr calls this resistance. The reflection can never be perfectly clean when the object is present because the object pushes back against the projection simply by existing as its own entity.
But in longing, the object is absent.
And in absence, the object cannot push back. This is why Starr defines longing as purified desire.
Purified desire.
Yes. When the object is removed, the friction of reality is removed. The perceiving subject now has full projective freedom to shape the object entirely around their own internal needs without any contradictory information getting in the way.
The mirror function runs without interruption.
Starr notes that this is exactly why longing often feels so deeply organized and coherent.
It feels perfect.
But it feels perfect because it is desire purified of corrective information. The object becomes a perfectly flawless reflective surface precisely because it is receding from reality and being entirely constructed by the self's internal rendering engine.
Which maps directly onto Starr's explanation of why the fulfillment of desire so reliably produces disappointment.
Oh, this part of the essay is brilliant.
It really is. When the desire is fulfilled, the actual object returns and its resistance is instantly restored. Starr argues that the resulting disappointment is not a measurement of how much the object has changed.
Or how much it has failed to live up to expectations.
Right. It is a measurement of the subject's own internal labor.
Exactly. The disappointment is actually a measurement of the sheer volume of projective work the self was doing while the object was absent. Well, I like to think of this transition like shining a highly detailed movie projector onto a blank screen. In longing, the screen is perfectly flat, so the movie looks brilliant. But fulfillment is like suddenly replacing that flat screen with a heavily textured brick wall. The bricks, the reality and resistance of the actual object distort and ruin the movie.
The return of the actual object shatters the purified projection. Again, we have to examine the precision of this mechanical transition.
You have some friction here, too.
I do. Starr states that the object, once touched or fully attained, can no longer serve purely as a reflection. The resistance of presence shatters the mirror.
You're hesitating on that absolute boundary between absence and presence.
I am. I want to analyze whether this zero-sum mechanical transition accurately accounts for the nuances of human perception. Starr demands an absolute rule here.
Absence equals pure projection.
And presence equals the sudden restoration of resistance and inevitable disappointment. But is the boundary between projection and encounter actually that rigid?
You're suggesting that human beings don't just drop their projections the second the object arrives?
I think Starr paints his framework into a bit of a corner here. He demands a complete on-off switch. But human perception is incredibly stubborn.
Very stubborn.
And we are remarkably adept at maintaining our illusions even in the presence of contradictory information. We live in denial all the time.
That's very true.
If the mirror function is as totalizing as he claimed in the first segment, if it literally dictates the aperture of what can even be perceived, why would mere physical return instantly dissolve all that projective work?
So you're saying the framework demands a rigid switch from projection to disappointment, when in reality the self might fight fiercely, sometimes for years, to maintain the projection despite the object's resistance.
Exactly. I'm arguing it's a gradient, a messy war of attrition between projection and reality, rather than a sudden mechanical collision.
That is a sharp critique because Starr really does present the transition upon fulfillment as an immediate shattering.
He does.
And he uses that sudden shattering to move into the third major segment of his essay, which positions desire, and specifically the disappointment of desire, as a diagnostic instrument.
Let's trace his logic on how desire diagnoses the self.
Starr claims that the specific objects a person desires map directly onto the hidden pressures and gaps in their own identity architecture.
Okay, right.
He uses a very specific example in the text. He says that if an individual's identity structure is organized around a desperate need for competence, that structure will systemically demand objects that reflect competence back to the self.
And those objects could take any form.
Any form at all. It could mean seeking high-status leadership positions or acquiring highly complex material goods that require expertise to operate.
Or choosing partners whose constant admiration confirms the subject's claim to competence.
Exactly. The surface doesn't matter. Similarly, if an identity carries a deeply buried, unresolved sense of inadequacy, it will systemically desire objects that act as a shield, covering or symbolically resolving that gap.
The mechanism driving this is what Starr terms projected significance.
Let's unpack that term, because it is vital to the framework. Starr argues that the meaning we feel when we are drawn to something does not reside in the object itself.
Right. The object does not emit significance.
The meaning originates entirely within the self, and it is assigned to the object by the perceptual apparatus. The object becomes intensely significant simply because the self requires it to be significant.
The self has organized the mirror function completely around it.
Yes.
So if a subject desires a wildly expensive, exclusive luxury watch, Starr is saying the watch itself, the gears, the metal, the craftsmanship, is structurally invisible to them.
Yes, that's exactly what he's saying.
What they actually see is a tangible shield against their own internal feelings of insignificance.
Which brings us back to that crucial moment of disappointment upon fulfillment. Because the meaning was only ever projected onto the object, it does not actually transfer to the subject when the object is finally obtained.
They buy the watch, and a week later it's just metal on their wrist.
The object is found to be insufficient because it was never magic. It was only ever returning the self's own projected meaning.
It was echoing the subject's own need back to them.
Exactly. And this is why Starr elevates desire into a diagnostic instrument. The gap between what their object promised during the purified longing phase and what it actually delivered upon arrival is actionable data.
Actionable data for understanding the self.
Right. It reveals the exact shape of the perceiver's internal architecture. The disappointment is essentially a negative space mold of the subject's psychological gaps.
This is where I think we need to press very hard on the theoretical validity of this claim.
Okay, let's hear it.
Starr calls this a precise instrument. He says the pattern of desire perfectly reveals the unseen architecture of the self, and that the resulting disappointment maps the structural pressures.
You don't buy the diagnostic reliability.
I question whether this framework is actually falsifiable, or if it simply operates as an airtight, closed loop that explains any pattern retroactively.
A closed loop. That's a heavy critique for a structural theory.
Look at the logical sequence we've just mapped out. The framework dictates that if a person desires an object, it reveals a structural gap. If they achieve the object and feel disappointed, it proves the meaning was merely projected.
Okay.
But if we're going to accept this framework as a valid diagnostic instrument, we have to ask, how could this analysis ever be proven wrong? What would a negative test case look like in Starr's system?
By a negative test case, you mean an instance where someone desires something, gets it, and the framework admits that it wasn't just a structural projection.
Right. What if someone just desires a glass of water because they are biologically dehydrated?
Right.
Are they projecting a need for internal fluidity onto the water? If every single desire is categorized as proof of an identity pressure, the theory perfectly seals itself. It categorizes literally any observed human behavior as retroactive proof of its own diagnostic accuracy.
It's the ultimate theoretical safety net.
Yes, it is. If a subject desires something and actually enjoys it long-term, a proponent of this framework could just argue that the structural pressure was successfully temporarily satiated.
And if they desire it and are quickly disappointed, they argue the projected significance collapsed upon contact with resistance.
Exactly. The framework seems to leave absolutely no room for a desire that exists outside this self-referential loop. It is an airtight hermeneutic.
I mean, that is brilliant for writing a cohesive, intellectually satisfying essay.
It makes for a great read, sure, but it raises deep questions about its validity as an actual predictive diagnostic tool.
That is a critical flaw you're pointing out. It functions perfectly as a retrospective explanation. You can look at any outcome, any heartbreak, any buyer's remorse, and trace it cleanly back through the theory.
But you cannot use the theory to predict an anomaly, because the theory's definitions do not admit anomalies.
It is systemically infallible.
And in psychological theory, infallibility is often a warning sign that a framework is describing its own logic rather than observing reality.
Right. And that seemingly infallible closed-loop structure eventually brings us to the final and perhaps most complex stage of Starr's argument.
The shift to appreciation.
Yes, the shift from desire to what he categorizes as appreciation. Now, the very first thing Starr establishes in this section is a firm negation. He explicitly states that appreciation is not a maturation of desire.
It is not an elevated, healthier form of the same mechanism.
He is careful to separate them entirely. He describes the shift to appreciation as a total systemic reorganization.
Right. It requires a complete positional shift for the perceiving subject.
In the state of desire, the self is planted firmly at the organizational center of reality.
The aperture is narrow, the mirror function is active, everything is recruited to serve the self.
But in appreciation, the self vacates the center and moves to the position of a witness.
A witness.
Yes. The mirror function is entirely deactivated. The object is no longer required to perform any reflective or instrumental function for the self whatsoever.
And when the object is finally released from that demanding instrumental role, what is the perceptual result?
What becomes visible is the object's full capacity to resist interpretation. Because the self is no longer filtering its perception through the narrow aperture of its own needs, the object is permitted to simply exist as it is.
The flaws, the highly specific eccentricities, the independent properties all become perceptible.
The object finally becomes three-dimensional. Starr writes that true appreciation is only possible when the object is allowed to push back, when it is perceived in its reality rather than used as a screen.
And to explain how a subject can possibly make this leap from the center to the witness position, he lists 4 specific conditions.
4 distinct environments.
Right. And he claims these conditions relieve the internal structural pressure enough to make this profound reorganization possible.
Yes, the essay outlines sustained proximity, satiation, maturation, and loss.
Let's look at how he defines each of those.
Sustained proximity means that over a long period of time, the object's natural resistance accumulates until the idealized, purified reflection simply breaks down under the weight of reality.
Makes sense.
Satiation occurs when the object has successfully provided enough reflection that the urgency of the self's need is temporarily reduced.
The hunger subsides, so the aperture can widen.
Exactly. Then there is maturation, which Starr defines as the self stabilizing its own internal architecture to the point where it no longer desperately requires external confirmation.
It generates its own stability.
Right. And finally, loss. Loss dissolves the stakes entirely. When the object is gone permanently, the demand for self-confirmation vanishes with it, theoretically allowing the object to finally be seen clearly in retrospect for what it actually was.
I want to aggressively question the mechanics of these 4 conditions.
I had a feeling you would.
Because this is where the essay feels the most precarious to me. Starr is very careful in his wording. He notes that these 4 conditions, proximity, satiation, maturation, and loss, are not guarantees.
Right, they do not automatically cause appreciation.
They merely make the capacity for the witness position available to the subject.
He writes that the reorganization still has to be executed by the subject.
And that is exactly the problem with the framework at this stage. Are these 4 conditions actually sufficient to prompt such a profound systemic reorganization, or are they merely necessary baseline requirements?
I see. You are looking for the actual catalyst, the spark.
Yes, I am interrogating the massive gap between the condition existing and the execution occurring.
Right. What bridges that gap?
Imagine a scenario where a subject experiences all 4 of these conditions simultaneously. They have sustained proximity to an object over decades. They reach a point of complete satiation. They undergo significant personal maturation. And perhaps they even experience a degree of impending loss regarding the object.
Okay, the perfect storm.
Yet, if you observe human behavior, you know that the mirror function can remain fiercely, stubbornly active even under those perfect conditions.
Oh, definitely.
The self can still absolutely refuse to vacate the center.
People can remain entirely self-centered and projective until their dying breath, regardless of the environment.
Precisely. So if the framework successfully identifies the necessary environment for change, does it adequately explain the engine of the change itself?
What actual mechanism forces the self to move from the center to the witness position?
Starr doesn't really provide a mechanical answer for that. He says the self has to be capable of occupying the witness position, but he leaves the actual engine of that capacity somewhat opaque.
It's just presented as a structural possibility.
But it lacks the ruthless, mechanical certainty that he applied to the mirror function in the earlier chapters.
Which creates a fascinating asymmetry in the essay as a whole.
It really does. The architecture of desire, the projection, the longing, the diagnostic disappointment, is mapped out with ruthless, deterministic precision.
It is a machine that runs on its own logic.
But the architecture of appreciation relies on a mysterious, almost ghost-in-the-machine shift in capacity that the framework cannot entirely explain.
It is a profound shift in tone for the essay.
It is.
So, synthesizing this entire journey Starr has taken us on, we start with the inherently self-referential mechanics of the mirror function, where desire operates strictly as a closed system to reflect the self.
Right.
We move into the purified projection of longing, where the absence of reality allows the illusion to run completely unchecked.
Without resistance.
That leads inevitably to the diagnostic disappointment of fulfillment, where the stark gap between the projection and the physical reality exposes the exact shape of the subject's internal gaps.
And finally, he outlines the structural possibility, however unexplained the catalyst might be, of genuine encounter through appreciation.
Where the self finally steps back into the witness position and allows the object to simply exist.
It is a remarkable, cohesive sequence of thought, even when we account for the significant theoretical tensions we've identified.
Tensions regarding the evasion of ethics, the lack of falsifiability, and that missing catalyst for the shift to appreciation.
Yes, all of that. But it's still a monumental framework.
It is. And it leaves us with one incredibly provocative theoretical thread drawn directly from the final pages of the text.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Because despite detailing how desire traps the subject in a perceptual illusion, Starr notes near the end that the projected significance of desire can actually function adaptively.
It can systemically motivate a subject toward genuine growth or development.
He argues that the illusion has utility.
Exactly. For example, the intense desire to master a discipline, or the drive to build profound knowledge in a field.
The ultimate meaning doesn't actually reside in the discipline itself.
No, it resides in the self. But the structure of desire successfully organizes the subject's attention, labor, and effort over years to achieve it.
The illusion of the mirror function motivates the actual work required to change the self.
Which leads us to analyze a brilliant paradox inherent in R.J. Starr's framework.
If the closed mechanical illusion of the mirror function is sometimes the necessary engine required to motivate human effort and development,
Is the eventual diagnostic disappointment of fulfillment simply the mandatory toll required for any real progress?
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.